Linda wanted me to let you know that as far as the kids go and adults, if you get bored, there are coloring sheets, and those are multicultural colored crayons. So you're welcome. Any of you and all of you are welcome to play with the crayons and color sheets if you'd like. Well, this is Linda and I's trip this summer to Jordan and Israel. This was about the best map I could find to kind of give you an idea of the geography of the area we were in the Middle East. With Jordan, of course, to the right there, we flew into Amman. And the way we did this trip, which is the way they recommend, is you fly in to Jordan, do what you're going to do there, then cross back into Israel, and then go back into Jordan to go home. So that was the process. It is extremely difficult to fly into Israel, then try to go to Jordan or any place else, and then try to cross back into Israel.
Can I say, okay, Amman, right here, that is the capital, and we were up here.
Yeah, I have a picture of that in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then where we had to cross over, we crossed over like right in here. So
Well,
just to kind of give you a...
And actually, the town where the archaeological dig that started this whole thing is actually Irbid up in the far northwest corner, right on the border of Syria. That was actually where the dig was.
Yeah, way up here. But we started there, crossed over, went to Jerusalem, then came back down, and we went all the way down here. So, and Aqaba. This is the Red Sea. So, I mean, we traveled the miles.
As my sister-in-law said, we saw the med, the dead, and the red. Mediterranean to your left. Anyway, just some facts I thought you might find interesting is the Middle East in general. When we think of the Middle East, which includes Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, anyway, all those up in there, is 6% of the world's population. They only have 1% of the world's freshwater resources. That's the collective Middle East only has 1% of the world's freshwater resources, but they have 6% of the world's population. Israel and Jordan, by UN statistics, are considered in absolute water scarcity. Jordan actually is about 2 countries above Israel in freshwater availability, but we're not talking that they have this overabundance of water, even though they're just slightly ahead of Israel. The next 3 countries that are in worse shape than Jordan and Israel are in North Africa. And then Jordan is smaller than the state of Indiana. It has 5.6 million people. As you can see, Israel's probably about maybe a third the size of Jordan, and they have 8.5 million people. The number one issue in the Middle East has always been the issue of water insecurity. And the water issue, if you begin to think of all the things that drive water, that water is necessary for, it's not just for you to drink. It is for crop production, it is for sanitation, recreation, any number of things that you can think of. We use water for, and we do take for granted in our country and in our part of the world. But imagine that you only have 1% of the world's water to try to grow food, provide for sanitation, and provide for drinking water. So one of the issues, particularly when you get outside of Israel, that they confront is because water is so much an issue for sanitation, they don't have water availability for the kind of sanitation you and I would think of as necessary for good health. So it's a big issue. The other thing that creates a problem is there are different areas in the Middle East that in the past have had more rainfall than they have at this current time. And in the last decade, the Middle East in general has had almost they have had no major precipitation in a decade now. When you and I may think of the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River as being this place, particularly in the Bible, where water flows and there's beautiful, possibly a pastoral landscape. Today, when we were there, most of the Jordan Valley and the Jordan River is dried up. There's nothing there. The way water would come in to the Middle East, it comes from Iraq, Syria, from the mountains. It would flow down, come into the Jordan River, Sea of Galilee, back into the Jordan, into the Dead Sea, back into the Jordan, and then on down to the Red Sea. And there's none of that now. There's not that constant flow. Israel dammed up the Sea of Galilee after taking control of it during the 7-Day War. Our guide, it was Israeli. You had an Israeli guide on the Israel side, a Jordanian guide on the Jordan side, and the Israeli guide even said that the 7-Day War was about gaining control of the Sea of Galilee for water. There were some agreements made with Jordan. I'm not trying to be anti-Israel here, don't understand me. This is just how this is all, we don't always hear about these things in our country. Had agreements with Jordan to allow a certain amount of water to flow out of the Sea of Galilee into the Jordan so they could tap into those resources as well. Shortly after the war and the new leadership that took over in the mid-60s, from that time forward, those treaties were broken. Israel dammed up the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee no longer flows into the Jordan. That's part of why you have this ongoing insecurity. Because it's about drinking water, it's about food, it's about all these things. Because there has been no rain, there's not a lot of good actors. Israel is probably among the worst from both sides. Drills into the aquifers that are available, siphons water out from the Jordan side. So it diminishes, again, the water resources in that area. So water is the oil. To give you an idea, there are many places in the United States today that probably within the next 20 to 30 years, if that long, water will be the oil, particularly in the high plains. It's the new oil, even in our country, fresh water. All sources of water are being depleted faster than they can be replenished. The Sea of Galilee, I'm hoping I didn't invert these numbers, but as the Israeli guy was telling us, currently the Sea of Galilee is being depleted a meter a year, and that's been going on now for about 20 years. The Dead Sea, which is a treasure trove of natural resources, we don't think of it that way because nothing lives there, but it has all kinds of metals and minerals that are very priceless. It's shrinking 3 meters a year. And you can actually physically see where the Sea of Galilee used to be. You can see where the Dead Sea used to be, and it is meters away from its original boundaries. So that's how quickly water is being depleted, partly because there is no water, and then the other issue is the natural flow of the water has stopped. So the water resources are retreating. The excavation at Abila was what originally took us on this trip. My sister-in-law, Marcia, which is married to my twin brother, Lyle, one of her cousins has been a part of this particular dig in the Middle East for over 30 years, through his undergraduate all the way through his doctorate. And then when the original, I guess you call it founder or beginner of the archaeological dig over about 40 years ago, retired, he made David director of the dig. And they go over about every other year. He takes college students, doctoral students, and other archaeologists with him to do this dig. So it's been going on several years. So I was going to take a little bit of time and show you just that particular dig. Went the wrong direction. Okay, this Abila is what is called one of the cities of the Decapolis. And the Decapolis is mentioned in Acts. It was some of the largest cities during Roman times, the most progressive, the most wealthy, all these things, because it was connected along the ancient trade route. That's what made these cities so important, was they were along the ancient trade route. Avila, like all 10 of these cities, were destroyed in about 750 AD, and then by earthquake, and then 3 subsequent earthquakes took place within the next decade and pretty much buried them all. Avila was one of those, and this earthquake stretched from Damascus in Syria through Jerusalem. So, and everything in its weight, that's how massive it was literally buried under meters of soil and rock. And Jerusalem itself, when we get to it, we'll talk a little more about it. But what you and I think of as Jerusalem is not Jerusalem of Jesus' day. It's anywhere from a minimum of about 20 meters to up to 200 meters under the earth. Anyway, this is Avila. This is an area photo. The city itself, I'll point to it here in a second, was much bigger. This is just the area they've dug. The city itself is called a tell or mountain. It's probably, the city itself at one time probably stretched all the way out over into here. Very large.
That canyony thing, that's on the other side.
That's Syria up there.
Yeah, that's Syria.
That's Syria
how
over
close
there.
They are to the border.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. So, they called it mini Grand Canyon. So where you see that gray up high there, that is Syria. And so he actually took us to that edge, which goes down, and he told the kids, because they love to climb, he goes, do not go down, because there are landmines there.
Yeah, landmines.
So those landmines are to protect Jordan from Syria.
And then Syria has snipers all along there.
Yeah.
Or being in that dig are only about, they said, 3 meters from the southern Syria border. So the 7 weeks that they were there on the archaeological dig, and our nephew that just turned 16 was with them for 7 weeks, they not only watched Russian and Syrian helicopters, but also fighter planes literally dropped barrel bombs and stuff the whole time they were there, and they felt the ground and watched the plume. The night before we flew in, we were just there the last 4 days of the dig to help dig it up and then go on the tour. The last 4 days that we were there, the night that we came in, earlier in the evening, David had been up kind of overlooking the site a little bit to see what needed to be finished up in the next 4 days before we left. And he said it actually scared him. He saw the helicopters come in and the planes. He said it was the largest plume of fire he'd ever seen in the 7 weeks. And he said it literally shook the whole earth. And he said what scared him at that time was that same evening, earlier in the day, Assad had announced that he wanted to push the ancient Syrian borders, and the ancient Syrian borders would take in the northern third of Jordan, would have taken in the disputed territories of Israel. And the only reason he would have said that was more than likely because at that time he had the backing of the Russian army. And at the same time, we were in courtship with announcing our support of Syria, the largest American military base in the Middle East is in northern Jordan. It was in that same line that Assad said he wanted to take. And we were courting Putin also. So between both the Israelis and the Palestinians, as we talked to them, it was concern for them, who would we really support? And it was a concern for them because you begin to see that all mustered up. Anyway, don't want to spend a lot of time on that. So David was glad we left. There's another aerial photograph of the Avila dig. There's one. Kind of gives you an idea. And I want to say it's down towards that bottom right-hand corner. That looks like the bathhouse. I have a picture of it. The bathhouse is just to the left, and to the right is what here. Right here. This area. There's what's called 7 pilgrimage churches, and they're very distinct, and they believe they found what would have been the he believes is an 8th pilgrimage church in the Middle East. And
these were Christian.
Christian. There's 28, somehow or another through area photographs and stuff, they've identified 28 churches in this area.
And they're all Christian.
All Christian.
That's what I was amazed at. Okay, olive trees, olive groves, right here, over there, those are olive trees. When it's patterned like that, those are olive trees. So they're not huge like we think of, they're just wherever they can find a plot.
What makes a pilgrimage church is the size of it, the number of columns. They found 8 columns, which is an indication similar to the other 7 churches. There's a huge, mind you now, at one time there was water that flowed through here. 2 miles away they would bring spring water in through a series of aqueducts, and it would literally go through all the churches and the community. And they believe that it ended at this pilgrimage church. And then at one time inside that church, you would have been, the guy believes it's a reference to John the Baptist. He hasn't found anything to concur that thought, because there is 2 places there would have been actual waterfalls built into the church for baptism. The other thing that's kind of interesting, in one corner of the church, they found a wall that has a entrance to the back of it, and that wall's about that thick. But if you're on one side of the wall and you say something, you can hear it on the other side of the wall. He says, not that Christians would be opportunistic or anything, but the churches were how they funded the communities. So if that's a pilgrimage church, wouldn't it be nice to have a prayer that or someone you want to pray for and have the voice of God talk to you? He said, now, again, you hate to be cynic, but he says, Christians have been opportunists too. So anyway, that was kind of interesting. This piece of road they unearthed this while we were there. This is what they believe is part of the ancient Roman road, and they have a fairly strong hunch that if you could dig back, see all that area there above? That's the earthquake. There was town back in there. This road would have come down through the town, and they believe probably was the ancient Roman road that connected all 10 cities of the Decapolis at one time. And they were going to cover that up. That's the other thing, is an archaeological dig, particularly on the Jordan side, they don't have the money to protect them. And so when they find the mosaic floors and any kind of artwork, they have to cover it up, or otherwise it's vandalized. And they, this particular road, plus the beautiful ceramic floor they found this year and Mom and I got to see it at the one church. They were bringing in enough sand that they were going to put between 3 to 5 feet of sand over the top of it, because that's the only way to protect it until they have the resources to do so. Jordan's a very poor country. It's the 5th poorest country in the world. This area is part of what they undug too. This would have been a shop area. Shops were along this. You can't really tell it, but that's what they believe were shops along that road. This is a bathhouse. It was added and expanded on probably over 1,000 years. That's the other thing to always remember. Most of this part of the world is that many of these cities, even though they're buried, have been inhabited 2,000 to 3,000 years. That's a burial tomb, Christian burial tomb. This is the school we stayed at. We were considered the Hilton of archaeological digs, because most digs simply live under coverings out in the open air, very little water resources or anything. This dig has developed the relationships over well over 30 years that they actually have a place that they can go to. This girls' school was home base. Out in this area is just kind of looking off from the school at one point. And see all these? Those are actually cutaways, and those are burial chambers. And most of them are Muslim. This was our bedroom. And to tell you up front, that mattress we slept on and those foam cushions was more comfortable than about half of the beds we slept on in the motels. I'd rather slept there. That is an all-in-one bathroom and shower. If you have any fetishes about your bathroom, you're in trouble.
So you get here, and they rig these up. So then you turn the water on. Obviously, you wore shoes. You made sure your feet were on both sides of these. You got yourself wet. You got yourself soapy. Then you turn the water on. Get done. And then you made sure you did not touch the floor when you put your clothes on.
And there's no adjustment on water pressure. It's whatever comes out, and there's no adjustment on the water temperature.
So then the kids would they would wash their clothes like at the end of the week because they would get so dusty, and they would save that dirty water, and that was, if it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. So if it was yellow, you did nothing. If it was brown, then you took a bucket of water and poured it in the hole.
And sometimes you did, and not everybody poured their brown down. You waited maybe 2 or 3 people before you got rid of it.
And no paper
No
went
paper.
down the hole.
Yeah, if you
It went in the waste basket.
Yeah, it goes in the wastebasket. And it's collected every 2 to 3 days, maybe. This is the laundry facility. It's buckets and.
You can't see the other half of it.
Yeah, no, I didn't have a better picture. Anyway, or I cut it off, I can't remember. Anyway, you just washed it in buckets with soap and the water out of it. You didn't drink the water, but you cleaned with the water. And then you kind of see the clothesline. There were clotheslines everywhere, and you just hung it out to dry. You had to dry it, it was air dry. This is hospitality. We were given the opportunity in both the bus driver for the group this summer, as well as the Antiquities Department of Jordan, provided two evenings in a row before we left banquets, and this gives you an idea of the food. Now, to mind you, this was at their expense. This was not funded by the government, by the bus driver. He did it out of his own good nature, out of his own desire to express appreciation for the work that had been provided him. So this is not the way they would normally eat. This would be like our Thanksgiving, but this is what they provided for 60 people. They spent their own money, and their families came. It wasn't just an issue of going and having a meal. They would have their entire family that was in the area come, and they wanted you to meet them and everything. One of the things you find in Jordan and in Israel, in the Middle East, is the concept of family goes way beyond, I think, what we even think of. It is the belief to share and to include others is a guiding principle for their culture and has been for millennia. So hospitality was important.
So then, so your food, the women would help prepare it, but they would not serve it to us. The men, they stood at the door, and even then you didn't see them. They would hand the food out to the men, and the men, the husbands and or sons, would lay it out on the table there. The women did not eat with us. And even when we went to somebody's, we were able to go inside that person's home. The oldest daughter sat and talked with us, however, she did not eat at the same time we did. And I think that's just one of those courtesy things. And even the husband didn't eat at the same time we did.
Yeah, the concept of taking care of the guest goes back to even within the scriptures. The idea that you are responsible for the health and well-being of your guest is paramount in Mideastern culture, even before your own. That's why when you see the story of Lot I mentioned today, Lot offers his 2 daughters to the men of the city. It's because the minute he took the angels of God into his home, their understanding is your family dies before your guest dies. And that today is still very much prevalent in their understanding is if they bring you into their home, they are responsible for your well-being. Gerasa or Gerasa,
Another, this is interesting for women. Napkins were Kleenex and had Kleenex boxes for their napkins. It's like, that's not very thick.
yeah.
But that was everywhere. That was even in the restaurants. They had Kleenex.
Gerasa is one of the cities of the Decapolis. I don't have a lot on it. We caught that just 20 minutes before it closed. That arch is probably one of the most famous arches that's done in a lot of different movies and things. I can't even remember what that says on it. I just know it's Greek. There gives you a feeling. I think Gerasa was important because it was one of the earliest digs back in the 1800s when there began to be interest in the Middle East in the beginning in the 1830s by Europeans. There's the Colosseum. Then we went to Beth Sham. It's located in the northern district of Israel at the junction of the Jordan Valley and the Jezreel Valley. There's a biblical account of the battle of King Saul and the Philistines. King Saul and three of his sons' heads were hung on the wall at Beth Sham. And then in Roman times, it was the leading city of the Decapolis. And it is huge, even what they've unearthed. And that's just three different pictures. The one in the bottom right-hand corner, that's a public toilet. You plop your buns between two of those, and there was constant running water, and you did your business, and a public bathroom was also like you and I would think of the coffee shop.
And that was male and female.
Yeah, male and female.
Together.
Yeah, male and female together. There's no separation. Gives you an idea of how big the city was there on the left, and it's huge area, and again, like so many of these cities, they haven't unearthed all of it. There's probably about, I think they said maybe 60,000 people there at one time. Sea of Galilee, Jesus calmed the waters, Peter walked on the water. The thing too on this trip, because we were with college students, we saw as many sites as if you were quote an adult trip going, probably would have spent 3 to 4 weeks. We saw in 7 days. We were moving. It was kind of like, there's the Sea of Galilee, go look. So we did. We did take a boat ride on it though. It was nice. This is a church that is at the mount on the Mount of Beatitudes. It's just very beautiful. It's beautiful on the inside. When you visit a holy site, women are to have their knees, basically the legs aren't to be shown. They prefer a scarf be over the head.
You didn't have to cover your head, but your shoulder, oh, sorry. The heads didn't have to be covered, but the shoulders and the knees had to be, even for men. So in this particular place, the nuns did have shawls and scarves for both men and women to put on. And I even noticed a few of them, it looked like they had choir robes on. The old ones that people don't wear anymore. But yeah, even the men, if they had shorts on or a tank top on, they had to cover up.
And culturally, men don't wear shorts. Which was kind of interesting because some of the boys, and I think it's a Western kind of idea that we carry in, that the rules surely don't, and the culture doesn't matter, is in spite of what they were given instruction, the boys, in the college-age boys, there are about 3 of them constantly wore shorts every day. And then they would go find somebody's shirt, pin it on around their knees, and everybody would laugh. But it made me think, we laugh, but how did they interpret our group's attitude towards their culture and how they understood what it meant to be respectful to each other and God? You know, so that's one of those cultural pieces that you begin to realize it's not the big things that matter, it's the little things that matter. And so most of the time we were in pants because that's the way even the little boys wear pants, you just don't see a lot of shorts. This was inside that church. That's the ceiling. That's gold leaf and just some different pictures. This was outside. The two fish and the loaves of bread. went to Nazareth, and like a lot of things in the Middle East, I don't know that they can really tell you this is where Jesus' childhood home was. It's just a home in Nazareth, and they dedicated it as possibly the place where Jesus grew up. And it could, because there's almost all the homes were similar, the spaces. And that's the same picture. The other thing that's kind of neat is this is actually, built over the top of this is a beautiful church that has a glass floor. And you can look down into the living structure. This is Megiddo. It's also mentioned in the Old Testament. Solomon and David both defeated and rebuilt the city of Megiddo. It's significant to remember that it was destroyed and rebuilt 25 times. That's how important this city was. And it's important because it stood at the beginning of the ancient trade route. Everybody would come in, the cultures, the politics, the social environment, the religious environment all came together and then would spread out through the Middle East. But this was the place that it all began. That's what made it an important city. It's because everything began there, the wealth began there. It existed before the time of Abraham. If you see that pot, what looks like just a pile of stones in kind of an egg shape in the middle, that altar, they believe, existed maybe 2,000 to 3,000 years before Abraham. Every religious type structure, sacred structure in Megiddo was always built over that pile of stones. When Abraham is told to do a pile of uncut stones, that's probably exactly the same thing he did. But it's interesting that in the Middle East, and both the Palestinian, particularly the Israeli guide told us, she said, if you think about it worldwide, wherever people have built sacred things before, they usually rebuild them there again. So that's always been the sacred spot. It hasn't been inhabited now for 3,200 years. But it was significant. And this again was destroyed during the earthquake. This is the valley of what you and I would call Armageddon. And where I took that picture of Megiddo, you look right out on the valley. What's interesting to me is that valley is not that big. And so if all the armies of the world are going to meet there for the final battle, if that is a literal interpretation, I would say bring it on, because they can't bring any weapons. There's not that much space. It is not that big. So part of what you realize when you're there is it does shift. You have to begin to it does force you to begin to intellectually think about some of the things that you may have been brought up with, being told about in Scripture, and what it means is when you get there, you have to do, in a practical way, you have to begin to assess what you see. And one of it is, again, is that all these cities and stuff that are mentioned no longer exist, and they're buried under tons and feet or meters of soil and dirt. But that's the Valley of Armageddon. Caesarea by the sea. There's two Caesareas in Scripture. This one is the one that's more prominent. That's part of that picture's been in a lot of things. That's the great aqueduct that went 2 to 3 miles away and then brought water into Caesarea. This was under Herod the Great, was the great builder of Caesarea by the sea. This was, at one time, you can't tell it, but that square, well, you can kind of tell the outline of that square. That was a swimming pool. Above that, several meters, was the top of the palace, and you could look out over the sea. Then he had a swimming pool, and below that he had a courtyard. What you see today is because the ancient breakwaters have finally eroded and lack of being cared for have gone away. The sea is reclaiming his palace. But at one time, this is how big a builder these people were. They had literally pushed the sea further away from land, just like we do today. If you've ever been in Boston Harbor used to be a series of cutouts and stuff way inland, but predominantly the Irish in the 1700s hand-filled in most of what you and I think of as Boston Harbor to build it. Same idea here. They filled it in. They brought in a mortar that's only found in Egypt that is actually dries underwater. Herod the Great found that, and he used it, and they created the breakwaters from this material that hardened like concrete underwater. while you're there, this is talk about Herod's courtroom, possibly the place where at one point under one of the later Herods, Paul would have been tried, wasn't tried, he was, tried, questioned, whatever. This would have been the courtyard where that would have taken place, possibly. And that stone is one of the only things that tells us Pontius Pilate really exists because his name is on it. This is a Crusader castle that was eventually built at Caesarea by the sea. The Crusaders didn't quite have the ingenuity of Herod the Great, didn't realize that Herod had actually pushed the sea away. By the time the Crusaders came in 1100, 1200 AD, to reclaim the Holy Lands, the water was already starting to reclaim the land, and they kept trying to build this castle over where the water was seeping in, and the castle kept falling in, and they finally gave up. But they never figured out that the water was coming back to its original boundaries. There's another picture of Caesarea by the sea. See where that guy's fishing out there on the left? That's an ancient breakwater made of that ancient Egyptian cement. Still exists, and that gives you an idea of how far out Herod the Great had pushed the sea. That would have, in its own right, that port would have rivaled any port we have today in the amount of commerce that went through it. We tend to think of them as sometimes I think ancient peoples as not having the ingenuity or the complexity of life that we have. And what you begin to see when you're there is there have been a lot of smart people for millennia. And life has always been difficult in its own right for each generation. There it is again. Again, that harbor, the seas encroached at one time. That was all the way out to that breakwater. That was land. This is a water tunnel that would have fed Caesarea. There's another picture of it. Then we got to Jerusalem. You see the dome of the rock in the backdrop there, kind of in the middle right. This is the only thing I'll say for me. I can't speak for others that have been to Jerusalem. It was not the spiritual experience that I had expected or thought it would be, and I'd heard people talk about, and I'd heard on Christian radio talk about. It did not move me closer to God. For me, Jerusalem was Branson, Missouri religious steroids. Everything has a price. Israel has fewer Christian sites than New York. Israel really isn't the place of Christian dominance. There's a picture of the Dome on the Rock up close a little more. And you see the walls? These are not Jesus walls. Matter of fact, there are no Jesus walls left in the sense of other than the Western Wall of what you and I think of. Again, between the earthquake's destruction, the conquering of the Ottomans, the conquering of the Muslim, and then the Crusaders, all the walls were destroyed. The walls that are standing are for the oldest ones are Ottoman, the newest walls are Crusader walls. So none of the walls are over about 1,500 years old. So it makes you think of some of the things in the West we talk about when Jesus returns, that he'll come in on. I remember growing up as a child, we go to independent churches and Assembly of God churches along the Garden Disciple Church, and they talk about Jesus returning and walking through the gate. He came in on Palm Sunday and all that. It's 30 to 300 meters under this earth. There are people's homes and houses all over the top of that what would have been the ancient city that Jesus walked on. That's a Christian tomb in the old city. This is up by the Mount of Olives, and the sun can't quite do it, but if the sun wasn't shining in like it was, when you look out that window, that cross lines up with the Dome of the Rock. This olive tree, there's not many trees left in the Garden of Gethsemane. That particular olive tree has the potential of having been there when Jesus was there, but really most of them have died. They've also been torn up to build city. There's not a lot of that garden left. The other thing that's interesting about the Garden of Gethsemane is that most pictures are painted from a European perspective, so we see it as kind of a pastoral setting. It was actually an industrial area in ancient Jerusalem, and it would have been a place where you wouldn't want to taking somebody late at night. And the Israeli guide explained to us it'd be like me taking a group of people and saying, well, let's go down into certain parts of downtown Los Angeles, New York City, something like that at midnight. How safe would you really have been? The ability to gain a mob was probably not hard for the Romans to have done when they took Jesus into custody, because the mob would have been there because of the nature of the area. So what you do is theologically then you have to begin to ask yourself, is the setting not trying to tell you something about the story? Which would be Jesus knows that he enters into a dangerous place. The place he enters to pray is in the midst of danger. And it's in the midst of danger that he asks God for help. And so that even sets the stage. As Marcia said later, she goes, after going to Jerusalem, she goes, I'm glad they didn't take us to Bethlehem because I still want to have my nativity scene. One possible tomb site for Jesus is here. There's another one, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Old Jerusalem is considered a possible site. But nobody knows. There's no name that says Jesus on it. And again, the reason, when we look for the tomb of Jesus, the reason we can't find it is he didn't use it. It was borrowed for 3 days. So for the Christian, the tomb is probably really not that important. Oh. Possible place of the skull. You can kind of see the eyeballs right there and the nose. You kind of stare at it. Possible spot for the skull. This crucifixion. There's also, it's either in Matthew and Luke, it mentions the wine press. That's a wine press that was found close to that tomb. That's why this is a possible site. This was all unearthed about 20 years ago. Wasn't that long ago. I just took that because I think you gotta love a guy with a good mustache. There's nothing significant about him other than his mustache, and he had a big smile. These are some pictures just in Jerusalem at some of the churches we visited, some of the sites. I mean, there's beautiful architecture. It shows you that people have always desired beauty. Again, that's over by the Dome of the Rock. You can see to the right, it would be a place that would be open in particular times to wash, clean up before you go to the Dome of the Rock, which is not a mosque. The mosque is behind us. The Dome of the Rock is a shrine. You can't just walk in there. If you're not Muslim, you would have to make spatial arrangements, and only one or two at a time with a lot of advanced arrangements. They might let you in. David has gone in once or twice in his life into the Dome of the Rock, but they will question you both at the mosque and at the Dome of the Rock. They will ask you questions about the Quran, the history. You don't just walk in to take a look at it. They actually have guards posted. Again, in one of the churches we were in, the Western Wall. Yeah, women on the right, women on the bottom, men up at the top. Segregated. And there are little, like you've heard about, little pieces of paper with prayers on them poked into the cracks in the wall. This is probably the only wall that actually exists from Jesus' day. It would have been one of the walls of the temple. There's a tunnel that we went down to the first temple walls. You can see those. We just wanted to give you a feel of what it looks like to go shopping in the Middle East. Stores everywhere, little ones. This is inside. This is inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the areas. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not a single church like we might think of it. The church itself is a sprawling complex that would probably occupy blocks. And it's made up of 6 different ancient Christian church groups who each began to build on this site because of claimed or real significance of being the place of Jesus' tomb, who knows, and eventually it all came together. None of them get along. This is 3 years ago, the guide was telling us the Israeli Housing Authority came in and told him, if you don't shore this up, we're going to have to close it, it's dangerous. And so there are some places you see different building materials and scaffolding. They worked for about a year and then everybody quit. This ladder is on the outside of one area. To me, I take this picture because to me it symbolizes the conflict and the struggle in Jerusalem. It's emblematic for me of the world. That ladder is 120 years old and still stands there. It's 200 years old. 200 years old. That ladder was put up because that window needed to be fixed. So a monk thought he'd fix the window. He put the ladder up, went to fix the window, and all these groups, church leaders, came out and began to argue about who's going to touch it, who's taking the ladder down because you're going to claim that spot and it's not yours. To show you how segregated it is, there's also inside the whole Church of the Holy Sepulchre, when the Crusaders came over, they didn't want to worship with the Christian groups that were there. So they actually built a church inside this complex, and they butted their arches right up against the existing arches, you could see them, and built a chapel for the Crusaders. And I call that emblematic of the struggle in the Mideast and the world. Is a lot of different people have a lot of ownership and none of them try to get along. So that's why I took that picture. I think it's symbolic of that reality. And why we say Jerusalem is so significant. It's said that Solomon Saladin, it's in a movie, Kingdom of Heaven. It's supposedly a quote by him at one time was, how important, what does Jerusalem mean? And he said nothing. And then he said everything. This is Masada. It's one of the best known. It's probably one of the most famous Christian sites. It's where a group of zealots, after Jerusalem fell, escaped to this Roman guard, what am I trying to say? It had a palace and everything out in the desert, but it protected the ancient trade route, and they took it over very easily. They survived there 3 years before they all martyred themselves. The reason they could last so long was it was literally just, I mean, it has an aqueduct system that gathered water from miles around, went straight into the fortress. It was nothing but grain bins. I mean, huge grain bins. They're massive when we saw some of them. So Masada was this site that the Jewish rebels went to, and excuse me, not Christian, Jewish rebels in about 70 AD. It was a 3-year siege. During that siege, there were 3 different Roman encampments. From what I understood, I took pictures of the 3. I could see that square down there at the bottom, down there in the middle. That is still a footprint of an ancient Roman camp. Things don't go away in the desert. There's another one. And the wall actually, down here at the bottom, this semicircle, that's where that ancient siege wall would have come up to. And that siege wall, I bet the base of the siege wall would probably be a half to 3/4 of a mile out, and then came up 850 feet. I mean, in and of itself was a massive structure. There's looking out over. That's the remnant. It comes up about half to 2/3 of the way today, but it still stands. The conflict became in the siege. Initially, it wasn't built by slaves. Eventually, they did take some Jews to begin to build it because it created a problem, a quandary for the Jewish rebels at the top. When their own people were building the ramp, they were forced to build it, but then the question is, do we kill them to keep them from getting here? So the Roman generals were actually quite smart in what they did. They put the Jewish people into a quandary. Oh, that's the other thing I want to tell you real quick. Misnomer about a lot of Rome. We think of Rome as being built by slaves, particularly under the Herod the Great. It wasn't built by slaves, it was built by people who were paid. It was probably, under Herod the Great, was one of the rising star times of Romans history. And Herod had this massive building projects all over the empire, and he paid them. The standard of living was going up greatly, but along with it, so did the finances and the cost of it. And so one of the things that Rome had to come to grips with in its later leaders was how to pay for the building projects. And partly due to maybe fear and other things, they abandoned Herod's idea that if you build the people, you build the government, you build the wealth of the nation, and they began to use slave labor. But originally it was all built by paid labor. Wadi Rum, this to me was what I would call for me the spiritual experience. I felt closer to God there than anywhere else. And this was the first time I would say I ever saw what would really be called desert. There's just nothing there. It's just rock and sand. This was our guide on the left, that a Bedouin that his family owns the travel service through there. Camels, we got to ride camels eventually. That's just a dog, a desert dog that was at one of the sites. That's one of the few trees. If you find a tree or a bush like that, there's water somewhere close by. And there was. It was kind of up in the rocks. Linda on her camel, ancient Nabatean writing. So that goes back about 4,000 years. So people have been living in these areas for a long time. That's a panoramic view I took with my phone of the sunset. When we go to Petra, another one of the famous sites in the Middle East, it's on the Jordanian side as well. Most everything you see is actually attuned to a leader. The houses are built also back in the cliffs, but most of the really big structures were either a government structure, but most were tombs. This Petra extends through a valley for about 20 miles, and this stuff's all the way along it. We didn't even attempt to walk all of it. What you can also tell is the beauty. People always want beauty, so they actually carve their beauty. The ancient frescoes that were there at one time have since most been destroyed, but they would put a cement plaster and then paint it. Even though they're in a very arid, desert, barren place, people still want beauty, and that's what you find in these places.
One of the things that, I have an art background, so the thing that I thought was very amazing and fascinating, they built these from the top down. They carved them from the top down. And the top is where the, if I'm getting this right, where the burial site is, and down below would be the gathering place.
And Petra's just a big valley that you just walk through. Nice, another picture. Up, yeah, let's see. Yeah, those are still all burial chambers. I don't know if they have a good picture of a home. Another burial chamber. This is the Crusader Castle at Karak. Karak had existed before the Crusaders. The castle was established and built over centuries, beginning prior to the Crusaders, and it was given to protect the ancient trade route. What you really begin to find out and learn is that a lot of the Crusaders, it was about reconquering the Holy Land for some, but for most, they became extremely wealthy because they could control and charge tariffs and other things in order for people to be on the trade route. And some of the Crusaders, we learned, were not nice people. This is inside of a structure in the castle, and as you'll notice, crosses were created out of stone to build a support. Those round objects are catapults, ammunition. Look. What did I do?
Maybe it's telling you it's time to be over.
Hey, Pastor, I'm just, my wife's making me do this anyway.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'd be sitting down.
Okay, it's fine. Yeah, that's it. We thank you all for supporting us in Ladies' Day.